October, we do celebrate, we organize annual national conference for folklorists called Krišjānis Barons Conference, because our folk song collector Krišjānis Barons has his birthday at the very end of October. But around anniversaries of folklore archives, it has become almost a tradition. Since 1984, we do organize international events for folklorists, ethnologists, for ethnomusicologists, and people from different branches of humanities, social sciences, and beyond. So this year, we are super happy to have great partners. So this conference is organized in partnership with the International Society for Ethnology and Folklore, and in particular 2 working groups, working group on archives and working group on cultural heritage and property. Thank you to CF for their support, also for streaming this conference. But the hosts today are Riga City Councils. They are our 3rd partners, and we are very happy to be here at this special place. First time for any folklorist, I guess. And so for the guests too, we enjoy the space here, and we will enjoy the first day of a conference here. So thanks a lot goes to Riga City Council. And the title of a conference, 100 plus 10. Most of you know, but I will remind you that there is some meaning behind the numbers. So 100, it goes without saying, we are celebrating 100th anniversary. But those 10 means, it could mean 2 things. One thing is that we would like to look a little bit forward. What's happening in the next 10 years in the area of archiving, in the area of tradition archives. And some of the papers, as you probably have already seen in the program, really will reflect on it. 10 could also mean that it's exactly 10 years this year since the digital archives of Latvian folklore was established. And so this year we are celebrating that one too. The entire team of the Archives of Latvian Folklore has been working on organizing this conference. So I really can't give any name because those are all names you can see on our webpage. But so here I would like to thank all my colleagues for doing great work. Well, in the conference kit for presenters, you probably noticed that we wanted to add little greeting from Latvian nature, and it looks like a honey cell. The honey is provided by a folklorist from our archives who wanted to stay anonymous, but everybody probably knows. So this is honey from his bees, and added is a little tiny thing which is juniper, and probably you know it has. In most cultures where it grows, it has certain magic powers attributed, and we were thinking that probably you might find it useful as Halloween is approaching very soon. Because in Latvian tradition it also means that it keeps away all the devils and such. Okay, to be short, I want to say enjoy your stay here in Riga. Enjoy the 3 days of academic activities we are having here together. And now for opening remarks, I would like to welcome here the director of the Institute of Literature, Folklore and Art of University of Latvia, Ieva Eglāja-Kristsone. Please.
Thank you, Rita. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and esteemed colleagues, it is a true pleasure and honor to welcome you all to Riga in these beautiful autumn colors and to this conference. And as Rita already mentioned the title, 100 plus 10, I think it captures both the legacy and the exciting new directions that these archives, our archives, represent. And of course, I'm also very grateful to Riga City Council for hosting us today. Riga's dedication to preserving and promoting cultural heritage aligns deeply with the field's values, making it a very fitting place to meet. And this conference brings together scholars from so many countries, around 17 maybe, and each contributing unique perspective on the evolving role of archives as keepers of tradition and as promoters of cultural understanding. As we can see from the Book of Abstracts, conference discussions will delve into various crucial topics, each important in the field, from the ethical responsibilities in community-based archiving to innovative solutions in digital preservation and the future of intangible cultural heritage. We will explore also how archives can stay connected with their communities, how folklore archives can reflect the depths of our shared heritage, and how we can make these resources accessible to all. We are privileged to have two distinguished plenary speakers, Maryna Chernyavska and my good colleague Sanita Reinsone. As the eminent archivist, Maryna Chernyavska reminds us that the Western way of archives and record keeping is not the only way and definitely not the only right way. And I am sure that we gather here to embrace diverse memory keeping practices and also to broaden the perspectives represented in our archives, ensuring they serve as dynamic spaces of inclusion and cultural vibrancy. Sanita Reinsone will share insights on digital community engagement, prompting us to consider, as she puts it, how archives can maintain a strong connection with their communities amidst the dynamic interplay of technology and tradition. And here I would like to express special pride and gratitude to Sanita as one of the main initiators and driving force behind Garamantas.lv, which now is an invaluable resource and inspiring model for digital archives also outside Latvia. And this gathering would not be possible without the remarkable efforts of our organizers. So I extend my heartfelt thanks to the soul of this event, Rita Grīnvalde, head of the Archives of Latvian Folklore, whose dedication and vision have brought us all here. I also extend gratitude to her organizing team, which she already mentioned, and also to the CF working groups, and once again to Riga City Council, especially the Deputy Chairman Linda Ozola, Dāvis Stalts, Kaspars Adjāns, and Austra Balode for their support and partnership. So let us take these next days to reflect, connect, and envision together. I wish each of you an enriching experience here in Riga, filled with inspiring ideas, collaboration, and I hope pleasant surprises as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eglāja-Kristsone. And now it's my pleasure to give floor to the Secretary General of the National Commission for UNESCO, Baiba Moļņika.
Good day, dear safeguarders of treasures, distinguished experts and guests. It is my great honor and privilege to join you in celebrating the remarkable anniversary of the Archives of Latvian Folklore by highlighting the enthusiastic and professional work accomplished in preserving the treasures of traditional culture in Latvia and worldwide, I would like to thank Archivists of Latvian Folklore, Institute of Literature, Folklore and Art, Riga City Council for the organizing this significant event and to wish every success. Traditional culture, in contrast to its modern counterpart, is the wellspring of individuality for every nation. More than 25 years ago, 2003, UNESCO established a framework convention for safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage, recognizing forms such as oral traditions, performing arts, social customs, rituals, festive events, as well as the knowledge and skills relating to nature and traditional craftsmanship. This definition underscores the delicate and unique nature of this rich cultural legacy, which, even familiar to us, is often difficult to capture and may be easily lost in the passage of time. Traditions weave seamlessly into the fabric of our everyday lives, often passing unnoticed from one generation to the next. A pair of mittens knitted by a grandmother, the rich aroma of mushroom sauce crafted from freshly foraged mushrooms, honey, and lovely folk songs that cradled us to sleep in our childhood. All these elements serve to keep our intangible culture vibrant and alive. We engage with them daily, embedding them in our personal identities and lifestyles. This raises an important question: why it is necessary to safeguard these traditions if they are already well known and practiced? Aren't they inherently safe? Unfortunately, such assumptions can be misleading. They are at risk of being overshadowed by the ongoing flow of modern culture. The archives of traditional culture leads the way how to grasp ungraspable and make the intangible values tangible. The cabinet of folk songs included in the UNESCO Memory of the World Register stands as a powerful symbol of this mission. It serves as physical testament to our oral tradition, bringing to the future voices and stories from the past. The Archives of Latvian Folklore are dedicated to this noble mandate, tirelessly engaged in the processes of discovering, documenting, collecting, preserving, digitizing, and making these cultural treasures accessible for all. Apparently, by housing our intangible heritage within the archive, we breathe new life into it, ensuring the resonance for future generations. On this special occasion, let me conclude my address by sharing with you one of Latvian folk songs, which says that collection of songs is a place from where you can get the energy and power to work with enthusiasm and overcome difficulties. I'll perform it in Latvian. Man bija dziesmu vācelīte, padzirnē glabājam, kad es gāju maltuvē, pavienai ritināju. Once again, happy anniversary and go not with the flow, but with the folk song. Paldies!
Thank you very much, Baiba Moļņika, for your lovely opening remarks. And now I give floor to Dāvis Stalts, who is head of the Culture Commission of the Riga City Council, so the hosts, which we have appreciated so much. Welcome.
Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to address you on behalf of Riga City Council as we open this international conference related to research of traditional culture and the promotion of understanding, as well as the important work with archives. Professional and in-depth research of traditions is crucial for nurturing future traditions as allows us to preserve the core essence of traditions in all their layers and interpretations. The existence of quality materials and research enables all our practitioners to avoid distorting the experience accumulated over centuries. but rather to transform them into new forms that are appropriate for our times. Or, conversely, to reconstruct them as closely as possible to the authentic. We, the Riga City Council, and I, as chairman of Culture Commission of Riga City Council, have prioritized traditional culture in the binding development plans of Riga's cultural policy. We are moving towards a vision where contemporary and traditional culture coexist in balance and mutual synergy at the pinnacle of our capital city cultural landscape. I emphasize that the conduct of such international conferences and our collaboration with the leading research institutions in folklore, both in Latvia and globally, is considered to have begun today. And I see a long potential for mutual cooperation ahead. In conclusion, I would like to share a small wish from one of the smallest nations of Europe called Livonians, and in our language, that's Lazlak, which means let it happen. Thank you.
Many thanks to Dāvis Stalts. And now, the first part, the opening of the conference, we can say it's open. And now we move to the academic part. The plenary lecture number 1 will be given by Maryna Chernyavska, esteemed archivist and researcher from University of Alberta Archives. She is also co-chair of CF Working Group on Archives. And I would love to express my personal thanks to Maryna for being in the organizational part from the very beginning, from discussing the call for papers to distributing to the audiences until today, when we kept the CF Working Group on Archives board meeting at this very same place, just a smaller and a lovely room. Maryna's plenary lecture is called Listening Deeply, Holding Plurality, Unfolding Relationships, What Archivists Can Learn from Folklore Archival Practice. Welcome, Maryna.
It's magic. Things are just happening on their own. Okay. Great. Thank you very much for this introduction, Rita. It is a great pleasure and honor to be here with you today to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Archives of Latvian Folklore. Many thanks to the organizers and to the host for creating the space where we can learn together, share, discuss, and reflect. I'm looking forward to the next 3 days, as well as to the next 10 years and the next 100 years of collecting, preserving, innovating, and making accessible Latvian folklore. If you think of a short biography that served as my introduction, if you think of biographical notes those of you who will be presenting had to send to the organizers, these can be regarded as official record, a trace that under certain circumstances may end up in an archive. I would like you to think about what this official record does not say about a person. I was born and raised in Ukraine. Although I haven't lived there for many years, I can't forget that today is day 979 of the ongoing Russia's war on Ukraine. I would like to use this opportunity to thank Latvia and each of you personally for your solidarity and support during this time. I now live, work, and learn in Amiskwachiwaskahikan, also known today as Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. It is on Treaty 6 territory and Region 4 of the Métis Nation, the traditional land and gathering place of many indigenous peoples, including Cree, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Ojibwe, Iroquois, and many others. I would like to acknowledge them as stewards and caretakers of the lands and waters, for many generations in the past and many generations to come. I would also like to acknowledge that these places and my background, being a woman, a mother, an immigrant, my folklore training and my information studies training all impact the way I think about archives, as well as my professional archival practice. Oops. I find folklore archives fascinating and very humane. I learned about their importance back as a graduate student, helping a user access a recording of the interview with her grandfather, whom she had never met. Or assisting another user who wanted to find out how Canadian prairies sounded in the 1930s for his documentary. Or teaching children of a woman who was about to turn 80 the lyrics and melody of Mnohaya Lita, a traditional Ukrainian celebratory song wishing many years of life. Children who didn't speak Ukrainian at all, but wanted to surprise and honor their mother with a song that had been dear to her heart since childhood. And yet, like many people in this room, my colleagues especially, I often find it difficult to explain to others, be it the general public or professionally trained archivists, what folklore archives are and what it is folklore archivists do. I asked an AI tool called DALL-E to generate an image of a folklore archive in Europe. That was my prompt, and this is what I got. And this is the result of the same prompt, but specifying that the year is 2024. Take your pick. We can deconstruct and analyze both images all we want. There are certain details AI got right, like those bound manuscripts that can still be found in many folklore archives today, or audio carriers, but some details are really odd. The point I'm trying to make with this exercise that it is really not easy to explain what folklore archives are. The fact that we are known under different names, as was poignantly noted by the founders of the Working Group on Archives of the International Society for Ethnology and Folklore, can add to the confusion for outsiders to the field. Folklore archives, folklife archives, archives of ethnology, oral history archives, archives of cultural and literary history, cultural heritage archives, and the list goes on. Even folklorists who are not engaged or interested in the archiving aspect of the discipline don't always appreciate that folklore archives are dynamic, living, breathing collections that continue to offer multi-layered understandings of who we are as humans and how we make sense of the world around us. One of the illustrative examples of such folklorist attitude comes from the transcript of the Mid-Century International Folklore Conference that was held at Indiana University in 1950, published as 4 Symposia on Folklore. The conference gathered renowned folklorists such as Steve Thompson from Indiana University, Shauna Sullivan from the Irish Folklore Commission, Åke Campbell from Uppsala, Otto Andersson from Turku, Albert Lord from Harvard, and many more. The second symposium was called Archiving Folklore, and it was chaired by Maud Kerpelis, a folklorist from England. At the end of the first session of the symposium, and there were 4 of them, the chairwoman noted that she learned that the archiving of folklore is a very special and thrilling activity and is not the dull detection of dead things. And the emphasis is mine. And yet she ended the second symposium with a note of regret. I'm sorry we have not been able to finish on quite the human note that the symposium on the collecting did. But I suppose that after all, archiving is not quite as human a subject. This is not what folklore archiving and folklore archives are like in my experience. In my experience, they're full of people, voices, stories, and images of all kinds, from the wrinkled hands kneading bread to street art and signs of resistance. The example from the 4 Symposia on Folklore is over 70 years old, but it is not uncommon to still hear such opinions today. I would like to disagree and argue that archiving in general and folklore archiving in particular is very much a human subject. I would also like to illustrate possible points of intersection, cross-pollination, and collaboration between archival and folklore studies, and consequently between mainstream archives and folklore archives, that I believe hold a lot of potential and can be beneficial to both. I don't need to explain what folklore archives are in this audience. While they may look different, what unites them is they study, document, preserve, and make accessible the culture and traditions of everyday people. It is not that easy to explain folklore archives to mainstream archivists, especially those who work predominantly with governmental records. Some folklorists complain that professional archivists are too limiting in their definition of archives, what counts as archival. And in fact, many of you shared with me that an archivist working, let's say, in a state archive wouldn't consider folklore archives, quote unquote, real archives. However, the understanding of archives within archival scholarship and practice has significantly changed in the last several decades. Archives have been reconceptualized from storehouses of cultural memory into sites of knowledge production. One of the reasons practicing archivists may feel somewhat protective about what counts as archives is that today, especially with the advance of digital technologies, anything gets to be called an archive. This is a picture I took last year in Transylvania, in Sibiu. It's a cafe, not an archive. And there are a number of clothing brands that have archive in their name, which I couldn't use their images, I don't want to be sued. Any set of materials grouped together by some theme may be called archive, even if it doesn't carry evidence of past actions or decisions and is taken out of its context. The popular use, or as some archivists might argue, misuse of the term archive in the media, on the internet, and in popular culture in the last few decades has demonstrated both the fascination or even obsession with archives, and on the other hand, the failure of outsiders to the field to understand the functions of archives in society and the roles of archivists in it. Due to the so-called archival turn in humanities and social sciences in the late 20th century, many scholars discovered the archive not just as a research tool, but as a subject of research. Today, humanities scholars continue reading, writing, playing, constructing and deconstructing, activating, querying, romancing, and even speaking back to the archive, and these are all from articles, without paying much attention and often being completely unaware of the significant body of scholarly literature produced by archival thinkers. Such metaphorical archives are often bright and shiny and short-lived, unlike professional archives and folklore archives, both built of brick and mortar, which have been around for well over 100 years and which both have an ongoing commitment to document, preserve, and make accessible valuable traces of humanity. This commitment is not the only common characteristic of mainstream archives and folklore archives. I noticed that the favorite and most common answer to almost any question one may ask a folklorist or an archivist is, any guesses? It depends. I would guess it's because both archivists and folklorists appreciate contextuality, but that's a story for another time. While I'm hoping to demonstrate that there is more in common between folklore archives and mainstream archives than we may think at a first glance, I should mention that neither field has deeply engaged with the other, with very few exceptions. Folklore studies literature has addressed folklore archives from different angles over the last 100 years, from collecting efforts of individual folklorists to established collection as part of national repositories, to concerns about organizing folklore collections and comparative studies, to analyzing folklore archives in today's global and constantly changing environment of the digital age. This literature, however, almost never connected with archival scholarship and was concerned primarily with folklore archives within folkloristics for and by folklore researchers. Similarly, archival studies literature hasn't addressed folklore archives. However, it has been exploring different new forms of archives and archival records since the 1990s. Ethnographic archival collections examined in archival scholarship primarily deal with indigenous collections within larger, often public archival institutions in the setting of settler colonial states or other countries dealing with their colonial past. traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions in archives have been also addressed mostly in the context of decolonizing efforts. While these are extremely important topics to explore, this research does not translate to the folklore archives context, nor does it help us understand how folklore archives participate in the documentation process and contribute to the collective memory of society. In what follows, I would like to discuss some important developments in archival thinking in the last few decades and consider how that scholarship can apply to folklore archives. In the short time that I have, I'm going to focus on how the understanding of what counts as archives has changed, as well as to consider the ethics of archival work through the discussion of power in archives and community archives movement. In his influential article, Evidence, Memory, Identity, and Community for Shifting Archival Paradigms, Canadian archival scholar Terry Cook traces how the role of archives in society has changed through the years from juridical legacy to cultural memory to societal engagement to community archiving, and the archivist's role correspondingly from passive curator to active appraiser to societal mediator to community facilitator. These frameworks not only reflect how archival theorists thought about what archives are and what archiving entails, they had an immediate influence on core archival functions and therefore on what was considered archival record, what documents had value, what was accepted and what was rejected by archives, how archives were arranged and described, and how they were made available and to whom. While these paradigm changes were profound for archival theory and practice, scholars like Cook, Galloway, and others suggested that the shifts were not clear-cut, but rather overlapping and often coexisting. Indeed, over a decade after Cook's presentation, one can argue that archives today continue to function as evidence and memory and identity and community. Our understanding of archives, their mission, and our vision of archival futures have to be constantly questioned and reflected upon. This is happening, especially in the area of community and decolonial archival work. One of the outcomes of the postmodern rethinking of the concept of archives is redefinition of what counts as archival record and inclusion of personal records, because in the past it was only records of bureaucracies, as well as various non-traditional forms of records into archives. Archives are reconceptualized to include alternative sites and stories of historically marginalized groups, cultural performance, oral histories, living practices of communities. Jeannette Bastian's examination of performances, parades, festivals, celebrations, and commemorations as archival records demonstrates that a cultural event like a carnival can function as an archive on the example of Carnival in St. Thomas in the United States Virgin Islands. Inclusive and pluralistic definitions of archives are crucial for the record continuum theory developed by Australian archival scholars. According to the continuum theory view, the archive encompasses, and I quote, personal and corporate records, a physical and a digital entity that exists in a complex socio-technical ecosystem and is a source of legal and cultural evidence and community memory and identity, end of quote. And in addition to traditional paper records, may include story, dance, performance, and ritual. A number of authors employ and built upon the community archives definition offered by Andrew Flynn, Mary Stevens, and Elizabeth Shepard, according to which community archives are grassroots activities of documenting, recording, and exploring community heritage in which community participation, control, and ownership of the project are essential. These collections of community records also include a much broader range of materials than would be traditionally collected and preserved in a mainstream archive. Along with other types of unorthodox archives, community archives expand our understanding of archival records, representation, and value in archives. Flynn, Stevens, and Shepard argue that defining characteristic of community archives is the active participation of the community in documenting and making accessible the history of their particular group and/or locality on their own terms. This motivation to exercise control over how the group is represented and who has access to their archives, and in this way to resist exclusion and marginalization of mainstream archives, is evident in a number of community archives projects. And I have just two examples here. The Rukus Archive project aimed to document Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities in the UK, whose experiences were invisible not only in mainstream archives, but also in gay and lesbian archives and in Black archives. The People's Archive of Police Violence in Cleveland is an example of an activist participatory post-custodial archive. The archive consists of video recordings of the People's Tribunal of Police Brutality in Cleveland, hosted by the local community organization. In April 2015, oral history interviews about police violence in Cleveland were collected both by local community members and attendees of the Society of American Archivists 2015 annual meeting in Cleveland. This archive serves as a resource for the community and record of the community. Decolonial archival praxis invites us to reflect on and reimagine our archival practice even further. For Jamila Gadar and Michelle Caswell, decolonial archival praxis is radical and liberatory, thoroughly anti-colonial, and works toward decolonization in alignment and solidarity with indigenous sovereignty movements. They remind us that Western colonialism and imperialism continue to shape archival practice, and point to, I quote, the need to reflect on the structure and content of the records, collections and archives we steward, the principles we espouse, and our intellectual and professional identities. Community and decolonial archival scholarship has had a powerful impact on the archival profession and provided a model of thinking about archives in previously unimaginable ways. Post-custodial archiving, shared stewardship of archives, plurality of record-keeping traditions, multiplicity of forms through which records can be manifested, community-defined access protocols, and other practices offer new ways of providing access to archival records impossible in the past. Yet other scholars have attempted to define archives within the context of the digital world. Mon Cleason, Hurley, Duff, Sporn, and Heron discuss online archives or archives in the cloud and argue that in this context, new meanings are created and new understandings of archives and relationships with archives become possible. The complexities of digital archives are rigorously described by Cabral and Caswell, who take a critical look at them and expose their political nature. For them, digital archives are never neutral, but they often reflect the perspectives and serve the needs of the wealthiest in society at the expense of telling more accurate, complicated, or diverse stories. Upward, McCamish, and Reed question how record-keeping and archives function in online cultures. Furthermore, digitizing analog records creates new contexts and new meanings. And while humanities scholars view online archives as being more accessible to wider audiences, and to a great extent it is true, and as having potential to disrupt power structures inherent in analog records, archival scholars are cautious and remind us of the power held by archival institutions and archivists to select particular records for digitization. Moreover, as John Schwartz argued, by making records visually but not physically accessible, we exercise enormous power. There is general acceptance that information technology and the internet continue having a huge impact on how we create, maintain, and use archives. Thinking about archives and their definitions through a critical lens helps expose systemic injustices and makes it possible to envision archives as radical liberating spaces of identity building and creating alternative historic narratives. All this contributes to the growing field of critical archival studies led by Ponzalan, Caswell, C4, and other archival scholars. As discussed, the term archive has been continuously defined and redefined since the 19th century by archival scholars and since the 1990s by the humanities scholars. Archival thinkers seem to be more open to the humanities contributions of to the understanding of archives, while professional archivists much less so. Scholars in the humanities seem to largely ignore archival discourse, and many consider archives a purely practical field with nothing to contribute to the theoretical discussion. The acknowledgement by the archival profession of the idea that archives have power came to the fore with an impactful article by John Schwartz and Terry Cook, Archives, Records, and Power. They and others argued that archives have power over history, collective memory, national identity, over how we know ourselves as individuals, groups, societies. They demonstrated that archives are created by those in power. They have the power to decide what is archived, preserved, and made available, to decide what society remembers and forgets. This article also marked the beginning of what is now known as critical archival studies. Before then, in 1970, historian Howard Zinn pointed out that the existence of archives in society is determined by the distribution of power and called upon archivists to document the lives, desires, and needs of ordinary people. Some archival scholars and professionals have been doing important work since the 70s, particularly in the area of archival appraisal, theory, and practice, questioning who had the power to determine the value of records. Others exploring issues of memory, identity, and human rights. Many practicing archivists, however, felt very uncomfortable with the idea that they were active participants in the shaping of archival records. For the most part, in the last decades of the 20th century, the archival profession as a whole continued insisting on the traditional understanding of archives as storehouses of authentic facts, and archivists as impartial custodians of truth. These postulates of archival institutions as guardians of accurate evidence of the past, and archivists as objective, impartial, and, in Hilary Jenkinson's words, most selfless devotees of truth, remained largely unchallenged and prevailed upon the archival profession until the late 20th century. There is a strong evidence that this situation has changed. Archivists have generally rejected the idea of neutrality and accepted the power the archives and archivists hold to include or exclude, to legitimize or banish, to privilege or marginalize, to amplify some voices and silence others, and the responsibility that comes with that. However, such understanding is not enough, and critique that seemed radical a few decades ago may only serve as a check mark and a pat on the back today if the archival profession is not committed to social justice and takes steps towards social transformation. So how does this apply to folklore archives? Thinking about power in archives, and the current developments in the archival field, especially those within the decolonial archival praxis around indigenous and other non-mainstream, non-Western memory-keeping traditions, community and participatory archiving can help better understand folklore archiving as a non-dominant documentation practice. Folklore archiving is a distinct memory-keeping tradition. Folklore archives are a Western phenomenon and trace their origins to 19th and some 18th century Europe. Today, they can be found on many continents all over the world. However, Northern, Eastern, and Central Europe has the largest number of publicly funded archives of folklore, which have been central to the construction of symbols of local, regional, and national identity. Folklorists study informal, non-official, vernacular, everyday culture as opposed to formal, official, elite. Documentation of such cultural traditions is deposited into archives where it is arranged, described, preserved, and made accessible, or, using the folklore studies terminology, archived, indexed, cataloged, and published or disseminated. Those who work in folklore archives almost always have advanced humanities degrees and are primarily researchers or lecturers. Their research activities and archival responsibilities are closely intertwined. Folklorists appreciate different ways of knowing. With their objective to document unofficial, informal culture, folklorists resist the dominant archival paradigm and legitimize folk knowledge and traditions as worthy of knowing, preserving, and therefore valuable for understanding society today and shaping the history of society for the future. While mainstream archival institutions are increasingly interested in community engagement and come to understand it as an essential part of their work, folklore archivists have been working with communities for over 100 years, albeit that work has dramatically transformed over time. Reflexivity has become a cornerstone of the folklorist field work, and folklore archivists have been long concerned with the issues of ownership of traditional knowledge, authorship of folklore text, cultural sensitivity around documentation and use of certain customs and rituals, and other ethical questions around fieldwork. More work needs to be done examining folklore archival practices, views, values, and the beliefs and assumptions behind them to better understand to what extent they correspond or go against standard professional archival practice. While folklorists document culture and tradition of everyday people, thus making them more visible and often heard, and contributing to the society's documentary heritage in unique and important ways, they inevitably exercise power, both as researchers doing fieldwork and as archivists describing, preserving, and making archives available. Although folklorists often study their own culture, as scholars they represent power and have access to resources often not available to the people they study. Their research interests define the questions that go into a questionnaire they design, or questions they ask during interviews, and aspects of life they pay attention to and document, assigning value by documenting some of them over others. Following John Tagg's declaration, like the state camera is never neutral, we can add an audio recorder in the hand of a folklore field worker is never neutral. Folklore archivists have never been just keepers or custodians of archives, but also makers, contributors, evaluators, and influencers of traditions. They are active participants in record creation, which brings both the power to include and dismiss, but also the responsibility to be open, transparent, and reveal bias. This transparency is facilitated by the fact that records in folklore archives serve not just as evidence of folklore events and cultural practices, but also, as Andy Kolovas argues, as evidence of the documentation process itself. Being an agent at the moment of record creation contributes complexity and adds ethical dilemmas colored by power relations when folklorists document cultural practices of communities they find destructive or oppressive. Barbara Klein questions, what do we do then when we publish the text sent to the archives? Do we delete all that which we as scholars, archivists, or responsible citizens do not condone or tolerate? Folklore archivists don't have the distance from the record creation and record creators that most archivists do. What is known in the archival profession as repatriation happens rather often in the world of folklore archives. Folklorists regularly provide copies or, on occasion, return a whole body of fieldwork to the community where it was recorded. This shows respect and recognition of the community's ownership of their records or their traditional knowledge. In a way, it is sharing power, which helps refocus it and keep it accountable. Navigating collective ownership in an archival context is challenging in the world where only individual intellectual property is legally protected. If folklore is owned by the folk, it is easy to lose sight of individual and community stakeholders of records in archives. Confronting and dealing with power in archives, including folklore archives, will allow us to move toward a so-called archival multiverse. The concept of archival multiverse was formulated within the Archival Education and Research Institute, an annual event that started in 2009 and grew into an initiative. Archival multiverse is defined as the pluralism of evidentiary texts, memory-keeping practices and institutions, bureaucratic and personal motivations, community perspectives and needs, and cultural and legal constructs with which archival professionals and academics must be prepared through graduate education to engage. This concept pushes against the existing overly constraining archival paradigm. Archival multiverse includes diverse perspectives on archival theory and practice, diverse communities who create, manage, and use records, as well as different contexts and needs these communities have. Folklore archives, with their long history of documenting everyday life, women's and children's activities and views, nuances and subtleties, history that so often slipped between the cracks, with their cultural sensitivity, scholarly tradition of reflexivity, careful attention to ethics of fieldwork research, care for records of different formats and media, more often than not non-textual, have an important role to play in the archival multiverse. What community folklore and other unorthodox archives have in common is their approach towards dogmatic ways and notions of how records and archives are and should be created, maintained, and accessed. Not only do they undermine the rigidity of the mainstream archival practices, but they also offer real-life examples of what unorthodox archiving may look like without claiming it is the only way it should. There are other features that unorthodox archives share, such as independence, taking agency in deciding on the value of records, having control over access to records, and approaches to shared ownership. However, there are also differences, which are commonly shaped by the specific agenda of each group that fuels their existence and motivates their actions. Similar to the mainstream archives, unorthodox archives have power and are used as tools to construct and express identity. If such power is distributed, acknowledged, and respected, there is a chance we can better understand and appreciate our complex and diverse past and present, and build a future that is plural, inclusive, and respectful. Participatory and community-oriented archival approaches to key archival functions provide useful tools and perspective to do this work. We already have great examples of how to conduct fieldwork in partnership with communities and document their cultural traditions on their own term. I'm thinking here about the Cork Folklore Project, and I hope we'll hear more about it later today, where community partners lead and shape fieldwork documentation projects. Folklore archivists continue challenging the dominant view of documentary heritage and what has enduring value, and therefore should be remembered by blending and transforming mainstream and unorthodox archival practices, but their default recognition of multiple creators of folklore materials, by intimacy and deep listening of fieldwork interviewing, and specificity of lived experiences of everyday people. Remaining constantly self-reflexive and questioning power dynamics will help keep folklore archives and archivists accountable, will allow us to be better stewards and partners of communities we work with, will further the recognition of the importance of our role in society and in shaping its collective memory, and possibly facilitate better access to resources to support the work we do. So what can folklorists learn from archivists? Collaboration with communities, when communities do lead documentation projects, when communities decide what needs to be documented, how and why. Participatory projects, when communities don't just participate in creating archives or describing archives, but shape research questions. Acknowledging the past wrongs in archives and moving forward in a better way. Using standards, and I don't have enough question marks there, and documenting decisions. Reparative description initiatives is also something that is worth looking into, and those of you who were in Breton last year may remember Guha Shankar's presentation about American Folklife Center working with indigenous communities and redescribing archival records using the terms and the knowledge of communities and not those who observed and documented them back in the day. In their turn, what can archivists learn from folklore archival practice? Relationship building is big. We all know that building relationships takes time. It's not a measurable project that has a start and end date. Folklorists often participate in communities' life well beyond their 7 or 8 hour work days. We attend their concerts, funerals, respond to their phone calls. For archivists, it is only the beginning of that journey. Respect and responsibility is another thing that folklore archivists demonstrate by not only documenting communities, but stewarding the documented materials in perpetuity. Collective ownership. We don't usually use the term creator in folklore archives, as I've noted, but we have so many different contributors, and it's just by default that all these agents participate in creating archives. In archival world, there's usually one provenance, one creator, although this has been changing as well. Folklorists appreciate variation, multiple stories, not one true story. Inclusivity, everyday stories matter. Making administrative documentation around folklore collecting available. In my recent trips around European folklore archives in the last month or so, many folklore archivists confirmed that correspondence with contributors or any other administrative documentation about fieldwork process is made available upon request to researchers. They don't publish it openly online because it's not for the general user, but it is available, and it's just amazing. Item-level descriptions. In archival world, this is unheard of, simply because of the large volumes of materials that archivists have to deal with. However, in the digital realm, every item has to have at least some kind of description, and folklore archivists have done that. And of course, experience dealing with large volumes of non. I will leave you with these questions. How do we engage with archival scholarship and make folklore archives more visible? How do we communicate what we do to other folklorists? What should we do to acknowledge what could have been done better in the past in terms of documenting traditions and move on to do better? How can we reconcile slow listening and slow archiving on one hand, and MPLP stands for more product, less process, which is an approach to processing large volumes of archival materials? We need both. How are social media stories different from materials in folklore archives? Can we think of fieldwork as a defining the value of materials to be acquired by the archive? What can we learn and share about ethics of fieldwork, of archiving traditions and making them accessible? How can folklore archives contribute to the multiplicity of perspectives and practices in the archival multiverse? And finally, thinking back to the question I asked you at the very beginning, what do folklore archives say and not say about a person, a community, and their traditions? Thank you.
So thank you very much, Maryna, for your excellent plenary lecture. Maybe I'll just go here. But please don't leave. So right now, the floor is open for questions, ideas, additional comments. So everyone is welcome. You can just raise your hand, but when you speak, you need to press the button. You can also vote, because, but you don't need to do it actually. Just press the button and the mic will sound. So anybody raising?
If you have answers, not questions, I'll be happy to hear them.
That too, yes. And before the audience gets ready, since you started with the sad fact of Ukraine still being invaded by Russia, and so could you comment probably what have you observed since February 2022? What's going on in the tradition archives, probably even yours, as a Kule Center?
I feel I'm not qualified, I'm not the right person to comment on the situation in Ukraine because I'm not there. I'm not living through the war. Of course, I'm keeping an eye on what's happening, and the colleagues who normally work in folklore archives are either on the front line or trip. I'm almost done. Right. Yeah, I've been on the road since September 14th, so it's been a while.
With your study, I'm looking forward to this tangible result at some point too. All right, you can just press the button if you want and start.
Thinking about the two sides, to put it really, in the future that we can all be looking out to sort of to really...
Question, Clíona. The conference that we organized last year is definitely one such example. It was a conference organized by the International Council on Archives section on research and university and research institution archives in collaboration with CF Working Group on Archives. The conference was held in Dublin, and Dublin being home to the National Folklore Collection, of course, it made the topic of community engagement and intangible cultural heritage and cultural heritage in general very prominent in that event. But aside from that, what counts is what we publish, right? If we don't publish, nobody knows what we think or do. So I guess collaborating on publications, publishing in archival journals, and for archivists, publishing in folklore journals, true interdisciplinary.
Thanks.
Just anybody press the button if you feel inspired right now. Yes, Martin Boyko, please.
So thank you very much for your presentation. It was for me a great opportunity to update my ideas about archives and so on. But tell me, please, imagine the folklorists have learned everything from, you mentioned from archivists, and archivists have learned everything from folklorists. Mm-hmm. What will be then the difference between the both? and complementary question, is there something we could call, if there is one?
Could you repeat your second part? I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, second part about there are a lot of disciplines and musicologists and historians and so on, and each of these branches has its own folklore about themselves.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Do the archivists have such things?
Oh, absolutely.
Archivist folklore, and does somebody collecting this type of folklore?
Such a great idea of a project. To answer your first question, well, first I think learning never stops, so that there is very little possibility that we will learn everything about each other. But I think it will just help us be more accepting of this multiplicity of memory-keeping traditions, because these are just two types. There are many more, and now there are so many more than ever. So each of us has our own role to play. I don't think I can change the way you do your work, or you can change the way I do my work. We have our own beliefs and systems. We can learn, of course, but it doesn't mean I have to drop everything I'm doing and start doing it in a different way. But having this understanding, I think, can only enrich what we do, how we do it, and just, expand our horizons, put it in a very cheesy way. About folklore of archivists, I'm not sure they call it that, but there are definitely certain jokes that some archivists collect. One of them, the only one probably I remember right now, there are not very many, but there are some. Ian Wilson, who used to be the head archivist and librarian of the Library Archives Canada, the National Archival Repository, before that position, he was a provincial archivist in the province of Saskatchewan on the prairies in Canada. So at one of his meetings with the minister and the schmoozing with a lot of important people, he noticed that one high official wouldn't talk to him, wouldn't even look at him, although he just introduced him to the audience. Then he realized that that person thought he was a provincial anarchist, not a provincial archivist. So that's one of the honorary titles he's still carrying. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, anybody? Yes, Suzanne, please.
Yes, thank you so much. This was incredibly educational, I have to say, both for myself as a folklorist and myself as an archivist. So thank you very much. And I have a very vague question that is perhaps not possible to answer, but I was thinking a lot about what you talked about, the decolonializing the archive. And very often, I mean, we point to digitization and the digital archive as a solution for that, for making archives more equal, more accessible, etc. But I was wondering if we perhaps become, is there a risk that we become blind to certain built-in inequalities in the digitalization process, that actually that we need to also hang on to analog archiving in making this sort of truly decolonialized or equal archive?
Thank you for this question. I'm thinking as I'm trying to answer it. When archivists digitize materials, they still keep the analog, right? That's the assumption. Another assumption is that everyone has access to the internet, which is not true. Perhaps in Latvia, everyone does. There are many northern communities in Canada, for example, where internet is very scarce and it may be available only in one public library in the town. So assuming that everyone has fast internet any moment is not true. Most archivists would agree that it's impossible to digitize everything. I know folklore archivists who have that ambition or have done that even, which perhaps again speaks about the volumes. Look at any governmental archives, it's simply impossible. And by deciding what to digitize, obviously, we exclude something else that we don't choose to digitize. So there's always this choice that we make on the importance, on the value, on what to make accessible, and our own filters obviously play a role there as well. What I believe is the most important is what my institution will digitize because I'm a digital archivist. So I guess reflexivity is the answer. Constantly questioning your decisions, documenting decisions is very important and something that always falls to the bottom of the list because, of course, there's another project to do and grant to apply for and things like that. But this accountability is super important for people who come after us. And they're not going to be happy with all our decisions, but so be it. I'm not sure it's an answer, but this is what I have.
Thank you. All right. Before we move to the coffee break and return here 3 p.m. for the next session, let's thank once again Maryna Chernyavska for excellent plenary lecture.
Friends, I did, oh, only now I have, okay. I shall repeat again. Labdien, dear guests and dear presenters, we shall start the 1+1 session of the conference. I really don't get still until now the way how the sessions are numbered because it changes slightly. Anyway, my name is Valdis Muktupāvels. I'm ethnomusicologist myself, but still I feel it's honor that I've been invited to chair this session. And what I shall do now, I will briefly explain some technicalities. Now, we have quite a limited time for all presentations. We shall have 4 presentations during this session. So 20 minutes are allocated for each of presentations together with questions. So therefore, about 15 minutes to presentation and 5 minutes to questions, and maybe half a minute for changing the presenters. So anyway, I shall show to the presenter that there are 3 minutes left, and if the presenter will not react to that, so still I will show when 1 minute is left. And if there is still a tendency to present more than 15 minutes, then we shall have less time for questions. It's also a choice of presenters, but maybe it's good also to talk from time to time. So, and now let me introduce our first speaker, Goršič from Estonia, and a few words about her. She is Senior Research Fellow at the Estonian Folklore Archives of the Estonian Literary Museum. Her main research interests concern the history of Estonian folkloristics and folklore archives. In addition to research activities, she has been active in the network of tradition archives and its working group at the International Society of Ethnology and Folkloristics, which we know as CIEF. She has initiated a series of humanities conferences for the school youth and organized several folklore collecting campaigns. So the floor is yours, please.
Valdis. Latvian. Good afternoon, my dear colleagues, and thank you to my Latvian colleagues for the opportunity to be the first in the sprinting marathon, learn from my mistakes. So, and as an extraordinary link to Maryna's presentation, I'm actually starting with historians. As Liivi Uuet, who is working at the State Archive in Estonia, wrote on the occasion of the Estonian State Archive turning 100 4 years ago, archiving is a very diverse field of activity, the impact of which on society can be almost imperceptible or, on the contrary, visible to everyone and highly valued by members of society. Folklore archives have their own place and importance in the field of folkloristics and humanities research. They can be a guardian of passing or extinct knowledge, an interpreter of currents and undercurrents in the surrounding living culture, and a sage of future situations. Any folklore archive in the world also represents the history of global and not just local folkloristics. Collecting, preserving, and archiving, giving a new meaning to folkloristic knowledge for the wider society, and making folklore materials available to society for reuse has also been seen as a kind of metaphor of the ever-circulating folklore itself. Following the national awakening movements and rise of awareness of the importance of traditional culture in the 19th century, many museums, archives were established in the Northern Europe and beyond. The foundation of these institutions had an integral and influential part in the development of early folkloristics and also other national disciplines into a full-fledged institutionalized academic discipline, as pointed out by Dāvis. And here, can we place the formation of the Estonian folklore archives? What did it mean to be a folklore archive in the interwar Estonia? Estonian Republic was a young state with strong emphasis on national culture, and the national consciousness was groomed mostly in the 1930s. There was an open approach to minority cultures, but needless to say, it was not always just plain sailing. Also, there was a question about what did it mean to be an Estonian? And even the language wasn't ready for this swift state of national country or state. The history of state archiving in Estonia, as I said, started in 1920, when there was a founding meeting of the Estonian State Archives. And as you notice, it was also attended by the folklore professor, Mattias Johanneisen. And although archives are a part of state, the development of Estonian archiving really started in the interwar period. And it got also impulses from the archival practices of the Russian Empire and the local Baltic Germans, and also from other European states. During the interwar, scientific research had a high status in the Estonian society and served the newly independent country by supporting the national self-image. But the state priorities and the proper funding system of the research was barely established before the Second World War. In Estonia, the interest in folk culture was part of the national movement. Since Estonians lacked their own grand written history, the intellectuals and politicians who started constructing the modern Estonian nation had little to rely on besides traditional peasant culture, and they used it. In addition, globally, the interwar era was filled with different isms raising their head, which on one hand helped to promote folkloristics, on the other hand helped to later demolish it to such a state that the words folklore and folkloristics are no longer used. Due to Jakob Hurt's wide conception of so-called folk memories, genres such as folk customs and beliefs were recorded as genres of folklore in Estonia. And after his death, Jakob Hurt's collections were located in Helsinki at the SKS. The idea to bring back these collections was born in 1922 in the Faculty of Religion of Tartu University. And Oskar Lorits was mainly behind the actual battle with the red tape. But in 1927, under the Estonian National Museum, the Estonian Folklore Archives were born. The idea of it being a central folklore archive was actually born in the heads of several folklorists: Walter Anderson, Oskar Lorits, Kaarle Kroon, and Mattias Johanneisen. Other folklore archives were an example: Denmark, Norway, Latvia, but also Finland, Lithuania, and Greece. The main tasks of EFA were to organize already collected material, make copies for use, serve the public from Estonia and abroad, collect additional folklore material, and to conduct and disseminate research. In addition, EFA aimed to collect the folklore of other nations living in Estonian territory and research cultural relationships. In Estonia, as well as in Latvia, being a folklorist did not mean living in luxurious funding. Lorits had to constantly apply for extra financing, also playing the international card, stressing that in addition to the neighboring countries, inquiries had arrived from more distant countries in Europe, from the USA, and even from Argentina. Lorits tried to develop the archive and develop the structure of it into the best possible. Stubborn as he was, he refrained from direct copy-pasting of other archival methods and developed his own way. And in 1937, he was proud to announce that EFA's methods were followed, to some extent at least, in some other countries like Finland or Lithuania. Also, broadness of research was possible. Lorits followed the Finnish geographical method, but he also promoted historic ethnographic approach, combining it with philology, cultural history, sociology, and etc. Having familiarized himself with Jakob Hurt's collections when they were in Helsinki, Lorits was well aware of the extent of success of Hurt's collecting campaign in the previous century. While developing and organizing the materials, it also appeared necessary to clarify if the empty areas and lacking materials were a sign of uneven collecting work or an indicator of regionality of traditions. You would have to know who you are. And as Marisar also points out, it is important to note how different the Estonian cultural space would be without the scientifically collected and organized knowledge of our folklore. And here I pose two theoretical questions. If there had been no Estonian folklore archives formed as such as it was, or if Oscar laureates had managed to create an independent institution from the folklore archives by extracting it from the National Museum, how would we define Estonian folkloristics and researchers now, knowing that the Second World War stepped in 1939? And in this rush with the clock and history, I come to the future. Estonian Folklore Archives now is a research archive, not an archive in the sense of the archival law, which applies to the state archive. FI is part of a memory institution and a living archive in active interchange with the society, devoted to collecting, preserving, researching, and disseminating folk culture and heritage. Since 2023, the Literary Museum, consisting of 3 different archives, actually hosts an in-house archival council. Is the value of folklore archives only in their age, or rather in their use value, their cultural value? The knowledge of oneself, the nation, the archive is not only walled up in century-old papers, but also in the value of base of each ideological or historical period, which is not only internal to the archival memory institution, but also broader on social and political level. From the very beginning, it is decided within the memory institution what material will be preserved there, what will be accepted, what will be considered folklore, if we are talking about folklore archives specifically. Self-knowledge is actually written in the very first stages in archiving and research. So archiving is not a random thing. Values change over time, and that what is not currently topical may later turn out to be excellent research material. What we are unable to collect today may, for some reason, be crucial to researchers 100 years from now. When we talk about value, we also ask who is the user base that the archive is directing its work to, and who are the interested parties who come to the archive, either physically, now more so virtually, to look for materials, and why do they want to use the archive. And again, linking myself to Maryna, we have to think critically about the fundamental issues concerning folklore archives and who we are. The explaining inevitably has to continue to the outside of folklore archives about who we are. But I argue that explaining oneself is better than not having a voice at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ave. Excellent timing. We have plenty of time for discussion now. So please, questions or comments from the audience.
I left most of the history out, so.
Well, while still there are no questions, I have one. Christine Kuutma has very nicely described how the definition has changed over time from folklore through traditional culture to intangible heritage. How this definition affects archives of folklore? Maybe.
Funny thing is, since I'm in the early stages of doing my kind of a holistical research on the history of Estonian folklore archives, it's a question that I'm pondering about. So perhaps I will answer that in writing, if you don't mind. Because as I see it, the context of where exactly this understanding of folklore archive changes, or where the labels change, the context of it is very broad, and it's very easy to glide over something that is actually very crucial. So as time changes, the values change, and therefore we have to change the labels as well. But at the same time, of course, we want to be ourselves, and most of us identify as folklore archives. It's a complex question. I hope to reply better in writing, sorry.
So we shall expect the article from you on this topic. Questions, please. I shall remind that to ask a question, we have simply to press a button and to
Perhaps
speak.
we can also levy a tax to help the work of folklore archives, since we are in this sumptuous setting.
If there are no questions at this moment, then let's express our appreciation to the speaker.
Thank you.
And let me present our next speaker, who is already approaching. So, Ieva Weaver, or Weaver in Latvian, is an ethnomusicologist or musicologist, just depending on situation perhaps, affiliated with the Archives of Latvian Folklore. She has researched the music of Latvian ethnic minorities, especially Roma minority. Currently, she is leading a research project on the history of the Latvian folklore revival movement. She is also teaching music theory and analysis at the Jāzeps Vītols Latvian Academy of Music. And the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Valdis. Try to measure my time of my presentation. Labdien, good afternoon. I am happy to meet you all here in Riga, in the very heart of Riga. My presentation will focus on one aspect of a 3-year research project we are finalizing. It is on the history of the Latvian folklore revival movement. We are a team of 7 researchers and a group of assistants and students. And I will present the developments at the Archives of Latvian Folklore regarding the archiving of revival practices. So, for a short introduction to the folklore movement in Latvia, it flourished quite rapidly in that time Soviet Latvia, starting from 1978, and it was both a form of folklore revival, cultural revival, as well, and also a social movement. Until the 1991, when Latvia gained independence from the Soviet Union, more than 200 folklore groups have been established. They are both rural and urban groups, and more than 30 of them are in Riga. And there are also both adult and children groups. And yeah, it was a cultural, aesthetical lifestyle and also a political movement. And what is important for today's topic is that it is a large number of amateurs who became interested in studying and practicing folklore. To understand the mutual dynamics between the Archives of Latvian Folklore and the folklore movement during Soviet times, which we are researching, broader issues to discuss are the relationship between revivalists and academics, between expert and amateur knowledge and practices, and between institutionalized and informal interactions. As folklorist Guntis Schmidhens wrote in his doctoral thesis in the 90s, the mutual interaction between these two perspectives has not always been easy or obvious, and the political context has impacted the local revival history. Generally, the perception of academics in the folklore movement community was that academics are public authorities. Also, the picture of academics as regulators, as well as regulated by the political establishment. And overall, for several reasons, they were quite distanced from the folklore movement as a social movement. Below on the screen, you see a quote from an anonymous authority speaking to revivalists through the leading official newspaper, warning the revivalists that their folklore interpretations should be accurate and that they shouldn't spread misinformation about heritage. So quite strict kind of voice. But I also would like to stress that the attitudes and the opinions among academics varied, and I will talk about their involvement and support a bit later. However, generally the wedge between the two perspectives was a factor that influenced the archiving practices. And what comes to the archiving during the rise of the folklore movement, among the professionals at the Archives of Latvian Folklore, the ideal of archiving authentic folklore was still strong, and the understanding of what is authentic folklore mostly didn't include revivalist practices, especially urban revivalist groups. And as a result, this new socially and culturally significant life of the archival materials and published folklore sources was left almost undocumented and unresearched. On the other side, among revivalists, there was a growing interest to do field trips and collect folklore themselves for their practical use, but many personal collections have not been institutionally archived. So that's kind of the short description of the situation, how it was and developed. Still, folklorists from the Archives of Latvian Folklore participated as consultants or introducers to archival materials, and three academic figures stand out as more active participants. One is folklorist Jānis Rozenbergs, who worked at the Archives of Latvian Folklore, and he was an active consultant and also attendant of revivalist events. And our archives hold his cassette tape collection. You see it on the slide. It's partly revivalist and partly kind of so-called traditional or more authentic folklore, and it's only partly digitized and registered, which is also kind of explains something about how revivalist material was understood. But it's in progress of digitizing, registering, and so on. Another figure is musicologist Arnolds Klotiņš, who worked at the Institute, and the Archives of Latvian Folklore was part of the Institute, but he was in another department. And he was the most important kind of revival theorist who was kind of an advocating voice, public advocating voice in media for revivalist developments and activities. And the third person is music folklorist Vilis Bendorfs, who also worked at the Archives of Latvian Folklore And besides that, he was a consultant about music. He also led a folklore group, Sendziesma, for around 10 years. Plus, during the history of emerging folklore revival movement, young researchers emerged, and some of them are even present in this room. So, yeah, after this brief introduction to the historical context, I will return to our current project. In these 3 years, we have created databases on folklore groups and on their links. We have done a lot of interviews. We have also explored official media and private archives. And what was very interesting to realize that actually the official institutional archives were quite poor in data about revival history, and the richest material was in media and especially in private archives, and that there is a lot to explore. And we are also building a bibliography, a list of studies on Latvian folklore revival, and there is an interesting tendency that most of the studies are done by bachelor and master students in their thesis, and not that much by professional researchers. So it was kind of more an interest of students for several years. The largest collections that the Archives of Latvian Folklore has received is a collection of color slides by photographer Alfred Stinkuls. It is very special because at the first part of 80s, color slides and color photography was not that popular in Latvia. It was rare, but he has really a great collection of several hundreds of valuable pictures. Another is the archives of the lead folklore revivalists, Helmi Stalts and Dāvis Stalts. You see the bags and boxes in one of the pictures, and it's still a long process to really archive and work with this material. And there are also other folklore groups and revivalist archives who actually there is so rich material which folklore groups are ready to deliver to the archives. It's about our capacity to really take it and curate it and work with it. So yeah, and now I would like to introduce also some most important infrastructure developments which help us to start to archive and collect data and also research their revival practices. So, and it will be some short screenshots from our archives, and I will explain what you see there. So one thing is that in the profiles of archival units, we have those two tabs. One is interpretations and one is relation, which mean, and in the screen on the left, you see the original archival unit, the recording, the player, as well as linked other data from the archives, which is in this time, it is transcription, sheet music, and also even digitized transcription made by our ethnomusicology students. And there can be also textual data, so it's on the left. But here on the right, I have chosen this interpretations tab, and you see that for this song, there are already several contemporary interpretations added based on this archival unit. So this is not developed for the revival project. It was for another campaign for popularizing archival recordings, but I see that it could be a very good tool for analyzing those overlayers of the archives, of how archives actually are used in the society. Another important development, which is also not unique to our project, because our Archives of Latvian Folklore is a part of a bigger interdisciplinary institute. So there are also literature researchers, theater researchers. Yeah, I'll be on time. And so it's developed together by various fields, but these are databases of organizations and events, and I haven't mentioned here also of personalities of individuals, that we can build a profile, and it's never ending. You can make it a huge profile of a, let's say, a folklore group. And here you see one example, which is an ethnographic, so-called ethnographic ensemble from Upīte, where you can add photos, recordings, description, illustrations, mapping, and persons, and so on. So it's never-ending big infrastructure where you can fill it wherever you have time for that. And now we are also developing the infrastructure for events, for example, folklore festivals. And it's not launched yet, it's in progress, but that will be also one other kind of infrastructure element. And the last one, and actually the most recent one, we decided on that only a week ago, is that it would be reasonable to develop a new repository for the folklore movement collections. Here you see a screenshot from several repositories we already have, besides our main big historical repository of the archives of Latvian folklore. There are some repositories where we collaborate with the universities, and each university can have their own repository, or Sanita Reinsone and her team develop autobiography repository, and so on. And so our recent idea is that we will start to develop also this new repository for the folklore revival. Yeah, and here are my conclusions on this process. We are going through these kind of revival research years. It is a conceptual turn in the curating approach of the archives of Latvian folklore to include also such revivalist data, and it opens a vast field of further studies and collaborations previously underdeveloped. As well as it raises the question of the scope and limitations, possible limitations of a folklore archive. There are also new curating, technical, ethical, and legal issues. And the recently developed infrastructure, especially digital infrastructure, allows us to collect new types of information. And finally, folklore archives have the potential to study the active users and interpreters of the archival sources and the academic knowledge that folklorists have developed over 100 and more years. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ieva, for showing both a broader perspective and also details which are very important to understand where is it going. So now we have time, 5 minutes for questions and comments, please.
Thank you very much. It was really, really fascinating. And I just have a short question on, because you mentioned this question of authenticity, and that academics did not perceive the revivalists as engaging in authentic folklore. But I was wondering, what was the position of the revivalist? What did they consider to be authentic folk culture? What was their, what was the limits of what you could do with traditional culture? And was the emphasis on sticking to something that was seen as pure, or was this room of exploring and developing? I don't know if you've done interviews with...
I will try to answer shortly, because these discussions on authenticity, not only among folklorists, but a lot among revivalists. It's so active and never-ending. It's so many emotions involved in this discussing authenticity, and it's so important for everybody. So I can't give one answer. It's never-ending. Really, we are also having a Facebook group for discussing our research kind of process, and it's really, there won't be one answer, but also it maybe is influenced by that there is this typology. It was also foreseen for the folklore festival organizers that there is those three types of performers, that one are like real authentic, and then there are stylizers, and what was the third group? So it kind of, this theory was built already at the beginning, so maybe some of them even didn't claim that they are also authentic. They are like, no, there is this big, great authentic thing, and we are doing our best to respond with our responsibility to respectfully work with this material. But there are also there are like, let's say, esoterical understandings who will tell that we do it authentically for, I don't know, our spiritual understanding. So it's really, it's a big one. Thank you. I don't know if I answered.
Thank you very much. A fascinating presentation. Really enjoyed it. I had a question about the interpretation tab. I found it exciting and intriguing. Is it only with regards to revival and movement archive usage, or is it planned beyond those archives?
Yeah, actually, currently, this was developed for another campaign, which was called Sing with the Archives. We did it like a couple of years ago, and currently it works that if you go to the Sing with the Archives webpage, you listen to song, you upload whatever interpretation you want. It can be classical musicians' interpretation or children's interpretation, whatever. And then you upload it, and after short, kind of quick checking, if it's all not kind of fake, some recording, if it's true, real, then we add it automatically to these archives. So, but I see it as a potential that we could really connect more the archival units with what people, whatever musicians do with those archival units. So, yeah.
Still, we have short time for very short question, or question and short answer.
Many thanks for the presentation. Two short questions. Is there any activities that have been done to like reunite or to go over the tension in between amateur survivalists and academician? And second question, how have you been aware that the private archive was that much, that there was plenty of pertinent private archive? Was there research from student? Was there an employee from the archive that have been in contact with folks? Have you made call to be aware of that? Many thanks.
Yeah, so the first question was about this building some communication. Actually, I see that our 3-year project has been very kind of important for kind of renewing and building kind of better and more kind of understanding, mutual understanding, collaboration between revivalists and archivists. So I think it's becoming better. Earlier also there were collaborations, but in a way I feel that now we are kind of coming together again. That's how I see this, all kind of a result of this project and also goal of this project in a way. And for other, it was about individual archives, the other question.
How have you been aware of that? Like, have you made a call to be aware?
Yeah, first thing we did, we established this Facebook group for our project and for sharing, for asking questions and so on. And so people, and it's already, there are 1,000+ members in this group. So revivalists are really interested in what we are doing and also sharing their insights. And so really, there are so many folklore groups who would be ready to deliver. And it's, about us to start to curate that. Yeah.
Well, Ieva, thank you very much. So, and now we are moving to our next presentation by Outi Hupaniittu from Finland. And she's director of archives at the Finnish Literature Society. She has also worked at the Finnish National Archives and Society of Swedish Literature in Finland. She is member of the advisory board for private archives. Hupaniittu is interested in development of archival functions, digital services, and cooperation with cultural heritage organizations. She is also a historian, enjoying empirical research and utilizing varied archival sources. Her doctoral thesis discussed early Finnish cinema business. In 2021, she and her predecessor as the director of archives, Ulla-Maija Peltonen, edited a volume, Arkistot ja kulttuurin perintö. The volume is the first peer-reviewed study on Finnish private archives. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for our organizers for inviting us and giving also to me a possibility to talk in this conference. As already mentioned, I'm a historian. I'm not a folklorist. I come from the perspective of historians and from the perspective of archivists. So my speech will resonate with what Maryna said earlier on today, especially when we talk about the position of power that we archivists hold and what is imminent in everything that we do. And I'm talking about the current issues that we have at the Finnish Literature Society and about our view from this day onwards towards the future. We have been archiving Finnish cultural heritage for almost 200 years. We've been here for a long time, and so the question is how we go further and how we position ourselves when we are composing the materials that the future generations will use. So these are the topics that I will discuss today. And like Maryna mentioned, the power of the archivist is very essential. When it comes to acquisition and appraisal, they are the most important tasks that we have because we decide what will be preserved for the future. And this has been discussed for decades. This is nothing new. And all the decisions that we make, in the end, they are subjective. They cannot be anything but subjective. And in the worst case scenario, it is a matter of gatekeeping or even cultural appropriation. And we need to work in a way that we are not going to those lengths in our position of power. When we look back of what ASKOAS has done in the past decades, in the last 100 years, there has been several innovations and ventures that have been quite modern, even controversial at the time. I have put there some of them. There are many more than these. Some of those have been projects. Some have been establishing permanent functions like ethnographic questionnaires that we still have today or the responders network that turns 90 years next year. So we have done innovative things before. What we are going to do right now. So let's move from the level of ASKOAS to the national level. We have in Finland a thing called National Acquisition Policy, and I would like to call it the Finnish way of acquisition. I don't know if there is in any other country a similar idea of acquisitions to the archives. If you have, please tell me. So it concerns the private archives. This is also a very Scandinavian concept, idea of private archives. So those archives that are non-governmental, those who focus on personal private archival material. Also the governmental archives, of course, they have private papers. So those functions of the national level organizations also fall into the category of private archives. So for about 5 years, we've had a national acquisition policy. Now, at the moment, we have 25 archival organizations partaking in it. We are on the 3rd cycle at the moment, so in about a year, I would say that there's 10 more archives. At least already now we recognize these kind of archives on the outer rim that we already consider in a kind of mutual understanding with us. And with this, our objective is that the cultural heritage is preserved in as multifaceted form as possible. So the 25 organizations, this is the way that I have grouped them. You can group them in different ways. These are overlapping. So first we have the Central Heritage Organization, National Archives, National Library, National Gallery. They are in the policy. Then there are the university archives. There is several other university archives that are on the outer rim. Then there are political archives, archives of different parties or political movements, also one presidential archive. Then there are archives focusing on culture and art. Then there's 2 archives, also kind of art and culture, but especially literature and folklore. And then there are others, for example, archives of aviation or migration or salaried employees, sport archives. So with this and also those in the outer rim, we have discussed what is the acquisition policy of each and every one of us. Where do we overlap? And also, what are the gaps in this kind of map? And we are trying to move forward into this kind of comprehensive understanding of archiving private Finland. But this is not problematic. When you look at the different kind of archives, you can kind of get idea what they are archiving. Literature, published authors. Music, professional musicians. Sport, only the top athletes. So this is very much a system of achievement-based archiving. You have to be, at least on a local level, a politician to get into the political archives. You have to have merits to kind of get into the acquisition policies. And also, folklore, we make the questionnaires, we decide the topics. There are researchers conducting the field interviews, they decide the topics. So how do we work with this? And this has been a discussion that we've had at ASKOAS in the recent years, especially since the national acquisition policy was established and we were able to, in a new way, see the whole field. And also in response to the contacts that we got from, on one hand, from the people and from researchers. So we saw that we need to kind of make something new, official, in order to tackle this kind of idea of achievement-based archiving. In the history field, the paradigms of research, they have changed a lot in the last 10, 20 years. I would call it even experimental turn, because in the field of research, it's always some sort of turn that is going on. Nowadays, in the field of history, the research is no longer so much concerned about structures or governing bodies, national levels, on this kind of political culture or important people and their decisions. Instead, the history has shifted to focus more on the individuals, especially on experiences and emotions. So in very similar kind of ideas that the folklore has studied all along, but of course from the perspectives of the historians. So here comes also this kind of wider idea of the significance of the ordinary. And one way, this is not the solution for everything, this is just one way that we have tackled this discussion. Last year we made a new acquisition policy for the ASKOAS archives. It has been in operation since the 1st of January this year, so this is a very recent thing. Now we have written down that we have this kind of special interest in preserving the everyday life in the ordinary. And the way that we are doing this is that we have decided to include unprompted writing, diaries and letters into our acquisition policy. This is nothing new. Like in the other slide, you saw that we have had a project collecting diaries in the 1990s. So these are functions that have kind of grown into our structures, but now we have noticed their significance and we have wanted to promote them by writing them down into the acquisition policy next to, for example, the fieldworks and the questionnaires, so that we can discuss this with those outside of our organization and in this way support the idea that we want to have all sorts of voices and all sorts of comprehensions, experiences. And with the diaries and letters, it is a way that we can still manage. Like in the previous presentation, you mentioned that there would be so much material that you cannot just take it all in. We have to narrow, and so we have narrowed it to the diaries and letters, especially in diaries that have been kept for a long period of time, and correspondences that are long and preferably in both directions. So here lies the normal, ordinary life in a way that people have reflected upon them on that moment that the issues have happened. And this is our latest acquisition. It came in last Friday. We got a bag full of diaries from a woman, a lady called Leena Kiviharju, better known as Back Leena. She had academic education. She had an office job, but for more than 10 years, she lived rough. And for that time, she lived in a couple of smaller towns in central Finland. During that time that she lived in forests and wastelands, she kept diaries. And now we have her diaries. I don't know what made her choose this kind of living, but we have her own ideas of what it was to live that way. So this kind of unprompted writings we are now receiving with our new acquisition policy. So, thank you. I'll leave the picture.
Amazing practice. Thank you, Outi, for sharing that. I'm sure we have lots of questions to ask, so please.
Thanks for your presentation. Just a short question. How do people know that they can bring their diaries to you? Do you make some campaigns, publicity, or how it works?
Somehow they have known it all along before, because even before we had it written down, we received some diaries. And I don't know, it's part of the normal way of we communicate our functions. And it is also because we have the national acquisition policy. So if someone offers their diaries to some other archives, they know how to redirect them to us. This is one of the key issues in the national level cooperation, that if some musicians' materials are, they have contacted us, we say that, okay, call to the music archive. So it's in many ways, but somehow people know already, and I hope that in the coming years they will know even more, though we have to keep in mind that we have to choose the amount of material that we can get in.
Thank you for your presentation. A question from an archivist to an archivist. Archival records are usually considered not media dependent. So archival fond is a whole of records, right? So this inclusion of diaries and letters, unprompted writing into your acquisition policy, does it mean that if a person offers you, together with those diaries, photographs and some other materials, you would say no?
It depends. It depends. The idea is that we cannot take the whole archives. It's too much material. But for example, with the diaries of Leena, we also received some documents with them. So of course we take them. But this is our way of limiting the material that comes in. Otherwise, it would be impossible to take the whole archives. But in this way that we want to see the context, that's why we want to have a long periods of time, or long spans of diary keeping or correspondence. So not just one diary. Of course, that's also possible if it's a special subject or something that interests us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Last year I had the opportunity to visit your archive in the Finnish Literary Museum, especially very rich and important. And I know that project that was fulfilled, carried out in the society to write down the life stories and materials from Ukrainian refugees. And this person returned to Kiev, to our Institute for Art Studies, Folklore and Ethnology. And my question is it continued with this program? These materials are gathered also now, or it was finished on this way? So a couple of years ago, or about 2 years ago, we started a project with Ukrainians that had come to Finland after the war started, and with that, we had an Ukrainian folklorist conducting the project. So she knew the language. She had the contacts with those who had come to Finland. So at that time, it was just a project for that period of time that she worked for us. Now, at the moment, that collection is closed for security reasons. We are not giving it to the language.
I shall ask one as well. What about digital materials like blogs and similar things? Are you also collecting them?
With the national acquisition policy, the National Library is preserving the Finnish internet. So once they have a legislative power to once a year sweep through the .fi. So the blogs, they are kind of their responsibility. But we also get electronic material. So if you keep your diary in the electronic form, we can take it. We can get it in. And also we are preparing that any day now someone will give us an email archive. We already have emails, but they are so far printed out. But we are preparing for that turn when they come in electronic form. So here is also a question of division of labor.
Thank you, Outi.
Thank you.
Very interesting discussion also, and our time is for the next speaker. And let me present Clíona O'Carroll from Ireland. She's a lecturer in folklore and ethnology in University College Cork, Ireland, and research director with the Cork Folklore Project, a community-based folklore collection and archiving center. So please, the floor is yours.
Valdis. Ciao, Dave, Labdien. Just waiting for this to come up. Oh, yes, sorry. So the title of what I wanted to talk about includes tightrope walking. And just thinking about that idea of tightrope walking, of balancing, I'm talking today about issues that many of us deal with and recognize in tradition archives. The balance between resources given to collection and archival processing work orientated towards the future and dissemination or engagement orientated towards the present, which are all pressing and important. And the balance in access provision of avoiding being overly protective gatekeepers, yet maintaining an impulse to advocate for what we understand to be the specific and wonderful nature of the material that we are in contact with. I'm very aware that I am all that stands between you and our welcome reception. So all I'm going to do is really illustrate some of these questions and how we in the Cork Folklore Project in the south of Ireland approach them. So the project itself, very briefly, is affiliated with the university, was set up on the north side of the city, which was a less well-developed part of the city, in collaboration with local groups in 1996. So we're quite young and we're quite small compared to most of the illustrious institutions represented here. Most of our researchers are working a half week on community employment schemes for people who are unemployed. We have a manager who again works half a week. We have no archivist, and my role with the project is in addition to my own job as a lecturer in University College Cork. Audio interviewing is really at the core of what we do, and we take quite a slow approach to interviewing, trying to provide space for the unexpected to come up in interviews, and also to talk about perhaps the negative elements of life that people might only bring up when they feel comfortable to do so. A very quick overview of our archives here. You can see again we're very small, around 850 digital audio interviews. We have our online audio interview catalogue, and the themes down through the years have come from the researchers, from the community, and also from funded thematic projects, and all the time diffuse interviewing. People come to us and say, you must interview my auntie. So we go and we interview the person's auntie. I must say as well that I must mention we're present as a long-term member of the community, and we do a lot of work linking people and groups up and mentoring other groups. Also working with volunteers more and more recently, and that brings more collections into our archives. At this point, I want to detour a little and just talk about a concept that I use with, discuss with students when talking about material culture. Dinah Eastop, a conservation scientist who deals mainly with textiles, in a discussion of the key principles of conservation, how the key principles of conservation affect decision-making, she highlights the importance of what we understand to be the true nature of the object being conserved. This understanding is not fixed, it varies over time and from context to context, and this is why it's always expressed in inverted commas. And this ties in with, I think, what Ava mentioned there of our understanding of value. Where does the value lie and how this changes down through time? Conscious articulation of a conservator or a museum's understanding of the true nature of an object is quite central. And the fact that there are choices made and elements prioritized due to interpretation of this true nature and advocacy for it of an object or category of objects, that's kind of clear in museum display contexts. Sometimes this comes into tension with other impulses of conservation, for example, with a clock. The fact that moving parts will wear out if it's constantly run will be in tension is in tension with the true nature, this timekeeping element, even the sound associated with a working clock. And decisions have to be made and articulated about which elements are to be privileged and in what context. And this tension can be very apparent in the planning of displays in museums. I have never seen a bigger fight in the glam sector than in about 2004 at a meeting in Ireland, a symposium talking about a traditional boat museum. On the one side, we had people who wanted to get a big hanger and put boats up on the dry there and conserve them and present them to the public. And on the other side, we had very excited, very angry representatives of the people who said a boat is alive when it's floating, when it's being sailed or rowed, and when the skills involved in its making or its use are being engaged with. So I kind of wanted to, even though, and I tell you, there was hair and skin flying in that context. Even though that discussion was in regard to objects that had a role in the world before entering the cultural heritage domain, it can play some role in thinking about what's important to us in our collected material. So in the Cork Folklore project, thinking of the true nature with regard to our material, for us, elements that come to the fore are that it is, that are worth advocating for are that it's oral testimony, consisting of sound and audio. And this isn't as self-evident as it might seem when it comes to expectations around access and dissemination. There's a tendency to revert to text and to conflate finding aids, such as transcripts, with the actual object. This is what Michael Frisch called the deep, dark secret of oral history, that it wasn't that oral after all. Secondly, for us, a key element to the true nature of the object is that these interviews are part of an in-the-moment interaction between two or more people. In curated dissemination, when an excerpt is used from a full interview, we try to always signpost back to this in different ways, by naming the interviewer as much as possible, even if it muddies the display, and by linking to the catalogue entry to the full interview. And in recognition of this, if it works, I'd like to just play you a minute and a half of some of the voices in our archives. Don't try to make sense of them. I deliberately mixed stories up. There are no full stories here. Don't try to interpret the Cork accent either. You can sit back and close your eyes or follow around the numbered pictures. And hopefully this will work. Thanks to our lovely colleagues here in our lovely technical colleagues who have set all of this up for us so well.
And there was a bar and a lounge, you won't believe this now, but the way to get the horse to the stables was to go through the lounge. So if there was anyone inside in the lounge, then he'd open the door and he said, "Up a minute there, lads," and clickety-clack through the lounge, they get the horse out, which was perfectly normal, and the lads sit down then again and have a drink away in the pint.
Yeah, you won't wear that no more, she said. "I'm going to a funeral now," she said, "give me a loan of it."
But my daily chore I hated was to tackle up Pedro, the donkey, we had a few pigs, and go around the neighbourhood collecting waste. We just called it waste.
But there was nothing happened to them. They've got a warning.
And no one knew anything about it.
If anything happened to those dresses, because all those jobs was at stake.
And he leant forward with his left hand and he walked down the window and he had it half down. And I was standing outside the door and I said, "Mr. Lynch, very sad news. At the time there was terrible bombing going on in the north, and he was that thought of something like that." And I said to him, "Mr. Lynch, Christy Ring is dead." He fell back in the seat. He had 2 white streaks came down the side of his nose with the shock. And the very words he said to me was, "But that can't be." The lights changed and he drove off.
So I hope you got a flavour there for what we're advocating for, the rhythm and the humour, the local accents. And if you want to follow up on any of this, you can go to our Cork memory map and listen to these stories. So over time, we've created thematic maps, always linking back to the online catalogue, to the full interview, naming the interviewer when we can. And then we have the tightrope again between the future and the present. Oh yeah, sorry, we've included other maps along the way, thrift maps and health maps, but always with an eye to the present and the future in terms of trying to create documentation so that other small groups can, with very little technical backup, can carry out the same kind of thing. Thinking about the present then, we engage in ways to bring the material out into the community through drama workshops, games workshops with children, and again, honouring the audio nature of the material with very simple collective listening events, evening events, memory mornings. And there's a certain kind of power when you have people in one room listening together, which is quite different to that online dissemination of the memory map. You've got the enjoyment of hearing laughter and exclamations of surprise at certain junctures, but the point where kind of this impact is most viscerally element to me in collective listening events is when this audience silence achieves a certain heightened quality, where there's moments when the intensity of this listening silence engendered by unanimous heightened attention speaks volumes in terms of the shared feeling that something is happening in the moment. And again, it's always our issue to balance off the in the moment with the future. And indeed, sometimes games break out during these events. And again, one of the questions is, do we try to document this kind of interaction? To collect, to record, thinking again of the future rather than the present. How far down that line do we go? And it's always a matter of resources. One more example now, briefly. Over the last few years, we ended up doing a series of more dissemination-focused projects, one of which was on the experience of infectious disease and public health initiatives. Thank you. Mainly in order to get the funding to keep our project officer or archivist in a job. So this one was on infectious disease, bringing oral testimony of experiences of infectious disease and public health interventions in Ireland together with biomedical commentary. And although we created an online resource, we found that it was the real world or ephemeral, the now-focused interventions that sort of grew legs and kept developing, particularly a physical exhibition, a couple of events there, then a physical exhibition, in which we tried to privilege the audio. So we foregrounded the oral testimony in text, which is a lot easier, but also pulled in a colleague from music in UCC to create a couple of, we had QR codes for everything that we had up there as well to go to the online resource so people could listen, but we wanted to involve people. So we got Jeff Wheater to create an interaction around a story of a medical student who in the 1950s during a polio epidemic in Cork had to manually ventilate a small child through the night. And the listeners had to ventilate in order to listen to the story. And we also had a bench following the story of poor Joe Scanlon, who has a small child, had to queue up and move along a bench to get the branding iron, which was the very painful vaccination delivery mechanism that they had at the time. Oops, sorry. So we had what I love to call an arse-activated bench to bring people in. How did we do on that? Quite a few comments here. I'm going to go past the family memories shared, the pictures, people kind of thinking, linking the past and the present. How did we do on privileging audio? Many people did comment, you know, the sound over screen approach is great, feels like there's more space in the brain to really hear and process the stories. So those are a few ways where, I'm just going to skip on here, to where, and a quotation from Andy Kolovos, who Maryna mentioned there earlier, access is vital, but maintaining the material in a manner that preserves the cultural, social and situational context through which it emerged is vital as well. These are preoccupations that all of us have. But I would add that when we're presenting and disseminating the material, and when others are also interacting with it, we need to advocate for the material and for what we think is the true nature of the object. But I would also use that idea to maybe remain open to understanding how these values shift and how these interests shift and the value and interest that may be seen in the material from others, and retain that open communication about it. Thanks very much. Paldies.
Sorry for pushing a little bit very interesting material. Anyway, we have time for some questions. Just while questions are coming, I have one regarding your story about the boats. The same is about musical instruments. All the time there is a quarrel between those who say, well, musical instrument is alive when it is played. And so who won that quarrel between those who wanted?
The museum hasn't yet come into being, but of course I think that logistics will play a large part. And of course, when we ask these questions as well, we can also ask, well, how can we distribute these different approaches? How can we serve the different approaches that come up through these conversations? In Cork, where I live, there is a community boatyard where traditional boats are built. There's also a club which rows them, and they manage to bring together quite a lot of these different elements. They do research, they document the boats. So they're serving one element of this. And I think that in some ways the answer to that is to link, you know, to really follow up on, identify and follow up on where different institutions or individuals see the true value as lying, and to sort of harness that passion to make sure that we articulate our choices properly, and that leaves space then for the other points of view.
Thank you. Good answer.
Please ask first, and then I ask. Okay. So we fight it out here. Thank you. This is always so fascinating about hearing about this project. And I was so struck by what you pointed out about that the listening, collective listening, is an activity that we perhaps don't pay attention to at all. But my question was on the taped interviews. Are they all done with the understanding that all of them can be made public? Or is there some, because as you said, I mean, creating that kind of intimacy, there must be also a lot of very GDPR difficult issues coming up.
Absolutely. So firstly, with regard to GDPR, we follow the British Library Oral History Collection process where we have a two-step with the forms. People agree to do the interview, but they're depositing the interview with it, and it's not a consent-based. It's the public good. The processing of the information is based on the public good. So we'll just put that to one side. The way I would describe this in terms of the intimacy is I call these a kitchen table conversation. And the way that we do them, there's a tension there, because we're generating a stable cultural text. It's recorded, but the way we come in and we sit down with people and we engage in normal conversation and we make it easy for them to forget that it's a recording, means that we don't put all of our interviews online to be immediately accessed. I've had interesting conversations with colleagues from other countries. So one Norwegian colleague would categorize these conversations as marketplace conversations. And I feel that this is a cultural difference as well. So for him, when people agree to enter into this agreement or conversation, they know that they should speak as if they're in the marketplace. I think in Ireland it's very much like the kitchen table. And one last illustration of that is we had a Chronicles of COVID-19. We collected material, mainly through questionnaire, but also audio diaries. And the choices that our Norwegian colleagues in the Norsk Kulturforskning, I can't remember the English, they asked people, would you like to make your material completely available with your name or to have it only available to researchers? But we said, would you like to have your name associated with this? And about 40% of people chose not to have their name associated with the material, but were very happy for the material to be publicly shared. And that too, I think, may be a cultural difference, in that in Ireland, people don't necessarily have the same attitude towards their neighbours knowing their business. So yes, now we had one interviewee who said, well, if you're not putting it online, then what's the point of me doing this? And yet we went back to him and we said, look, is there anything there that you would prefer us not to put online? And in one story, he forgot a friend's name and he opted not to have that put online. It's innocuous, it's simple, but he didn't want that to be shared.
Thank you very much for your presentation, very interesting. I wondered if digital storytelling as a technique plays any role in this, because it's one way of collecting all kinds of stories, and it has some interesting toolkit underneath, including ethical considerations, etc.
Thanks for that. I've seen the phrase digital storytelling, and I've looked at some of the kind of workshops that different people have. I'm not entirely sure if we're going to be talking about exactly the same thing. One of the things that I found with the idea of digital storytelling is it brings the self-selection down quite narrow in terms of people who may already be generating material and putting it out there. So I don't know if that's quite the same thing that we're talking about. Another issue is that we don't necessarily have the platforms. I mean, I envy our colleagues in a lot of the institutions here. When we started doing online questionnaires, we saw the sophisticated platforms that our colleagues have for gathering material and making sure that all of the contributors are very aware of where the material is going and very aware of the steps of deposit or consent. So for us, also because we're operating on a shoestring, perhaps we were wrongly intimidated in terms of technology involved.
They have exciting workshops that are actually free, and I'll drop you afterwards. We can exchange emails. I'll drop you some information if it's of any use. I understand the resources, yes, but you can go budget friendly.
Absolutely. I did one workshop, all right, but you know, sometimes I think maybe being set in our ways. Also, with one of the main aims of our organisation is training. and is providing people with skills, so training people up as interviewers and having them go through that terribly, terribly frightening experience of being an interviewer for the first time, which really gives people a lot of extra confidence when they're going on to other things. So we do very much concentrate on that role too.
So, Clíona, thank you very much. And I see the discussion still will be going on. Maybe we shall have some more time in between our activities. And thank you all presenters for this very interesting, informative and inspirational session that we had. But I think now we have announcement from the organizers, please.